system. It took him 11 weeks by foot to make the journey. Those who actually were taken there by prisoner were taken by boat. It was a 3-month journey from Odessa all the way through the Suez Canal, around Africa, and eventually to Sakhalin Island itself. Siberia in the penal system was quite remote geographically, but it was anything from remote for Russian society as a social phenomenon. It was certainly in the 20th century, but also to an extent in the 19th century, something which touched the lives of many, many families in one way or another. And that is reflected in its presence in much of Russian culture as a theme. We see it in the works of Dostoevsky, of course, Yeskov, Chekhov, Solzhenitsyn, of course, in the 20th century, and a number of other writers, as well as painters such as Levitan and Repin. But we also see it reflected in common culture, in the blatnoy jargon, the thieves' argot, which is common in cities across Russia today. We are fortunate to have with us tonight two renowned experts on the Russian penal colony system, both for the 19th and the 20th century. We welcome, first of all, Daniel Beer, who is a lecturer at Royal Holloway College in history. He is the author of The House of the Dead, which is shortlisted for this year's Pushkin House Book Prize Award. Yes, here's a copy of it. It is a fantastic read. It is, on the one hand, full of pathos, as the topic itself would demand, but it also is compassionate. It's a very good read and a gripping read. I wouldn't say it's an easy read in the sense that the topic itself is very difficult, but it is elegantly written and very hard to put down. It treats the topic in all of its complexities, and one of the topics which I hope will come up in the discussion tonight are the continuities and the discontinuities between the 19th century, the pre-revolutionary phenomena of the penal system in Siberia, and the post-revolutionary phenomena. And who should be better positioned to talk about that topic than our other guests this evening, who will be in conversation with Daniel, and Applebaum. Anne's accomplishments are too long to list. She is a celebrated foreign correspondent. She is a leading opinion writer for the Washington Post. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian as well for her book on the Gulag. Since then, she's published another path-breaking study on the emergence of the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe or Central Europe, both Central Europe. And we'll be coming out with a book on the Ukrainian famine later this evening. Excuse me, later this year. Later this evening. Yes.
Yes, I'm going to be writing it very fast.
But later this evening, we hope after the presentation, if you don't have a copy already of Daniel's book, you will find them downstairs, as well as some of Anne's previous work. So please enjoy the evening. Read not only Daniel's book, but all the books that are mentioned on the Pushkin House Book Prize Award. They're all fantastic and provide great insight into this fascinating and ever so important society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you, Pushkin House, for turning on the air conditioning, because it wasn't very... I'm wondering if maybe you could close the window there, because now that the air conditioning's on, because I keep hearing noise from the outside.
No problem.
So that would be very nice. So I'm the author of a book on the Gulag. Daniel's an author of a book on the Tsarist prison system. But I think what we'd like to do is start with his book, because his book is new and his book has just been nominated for this prize. And I will start by me asking him, and maybe you're also going to ask him a little bit about the nature of his book and the nature of the really incredible research that he did. And then after that, Daniel and I will do a little compare and contrast. We'll talk about some of the issues that are in both of our books. And my book was published 15 years ago, so maybe some of you have read it. But Daniel's is a new one, but they're very interesting ways in which they compare and I think they even have some implications for things that are happening in Russia now, so we'll get to that too. But I think you wanted to ask the first question as the chief moderator.
Well, I'm happy to. Actually, I wanted to return to the question of Chekhov. When Chekhov went to Sakhalin, he said that he was, in order to get permission to go to this zone that was under tight state control,
Seat here.
he said that he was going to conduct a census, which in fact he did. He went to all of the villages, he and his assistants, as well as all of the cottages, and took a census of everybody who was on the island. But really what he was attempting to do was to write an expose on the prison system. This was a time in Russia when the Demco Movement, this was a type of early version of an NGO, were addressing all variety of social issues. And one of the social issues that Chekhov was concerned about was the harshness of the Russian penal system and the need for reform. He published his work in, I think, seven installations in Ruskaya Misa in 1893, 1894. And this would have been right after the Great Famine of 1891, which some people point to as the beginning of the revolutionary movement in Russia, when the state proved incapable of managing a huge social crisis and had to invite in these social groups to try to administer to the needy. So the question is, did Chekhov's writing have an impact? Did it lead to a reform in the system?
Do you want to start there? Or do you want to
I think that may be later in the
a
story.
more advanced question.
Yes.
Why don't we start with you talking a little bit about your book? This is a history of the Tsarist prisons. But could you talk a little bit about what what led you to write it, and what were the kinds of sources that you used, and what did you learn from writing it that you didn't know previously? What did you uncover about the structure of the prison system? You said something very interesting to me about a dinner at the Pushkin House prize dinner about the prison system being a kind of mirror of the society. So maybe you could begin by talking a little bit about that, and then we'll get to Chekhov.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. So yeah, I suppose I think the phrase which instantly comes to mind is, I think Dostoevsky said that you can instantly judge the degree of a society's civilization when you open the door of its prisons. My interest really in the Siberian exile system grew out of, I suppose, an unhealthy and abiding interest in sort of punishment and deviance and crime in Russia. I was interested in the way in which key texts like Dostoevsky's House from the Dead, the notion of House of the Dead, from which, yes, I shamelessly pilfered the title of my own book, really become kind of literary monuments across the 19th century, which become they're central texts in the way in which Russians come to view their own state. Chekhov's would be another example, we'll come on to that later, and the nature of the regime that rules over them. So my interest in the exile system, really from the very beginning, was to explore how it worked, and the sort of social history of that period. What was the fate of the nearly 1 million Tsarist subjects who are exiled across the Ural Mountains from roughly the beginning of the 19th century to the outbreak of the First World War. What was the nature of that experience? But I was also interested in the impact that the Siberian exile system had really on the kind of political and cultural history of Russia more widely. So how did it hold up a kind of mirror to educated Russians, certainly?
How much would you, can I just interrupt you, how much would people have known about the system? I mean, how much, and how present was it in people's lives? Was it, because the Gulag was present in people's lives later on, that people knew about it, even if they didn't know the details of how it worked. Absolutely everybody was aware that it existed, and some cousin had been there at the very least. Is that as true in Tsarist Russia?
I think, yeah, I mean, essentially, obviously the numbers are smaller. It doesn't, like, we're not talking about the same numbers of people exiled in the Tsarist period, but exile, so exile to settlement for kind of less serious crimes and exile to penal labour for capital offences is the default punishment for crimes across the Russian Empire. So it's not only reserved for educated oppositionists, revolutionaries, dissenters. It is a tool of social control used by peasant communities. So, you know, in the absence of a prison system effectively in European Russia, someone guilty of serious crimes is identified by their own village or their own merchant community and is then turned over to the authorities for deportation to Siberia. There's no judicial process here, by the way, so it becomes a kind of flexible tool which enables peasant communities.
No judicial process, so and it was administrative exile. How did people get sent to exile?
So you are arrested, and then for at least the first half of the 19th century, you walk. So you are marched in convoys, deportation convoys, numbering anywhere between 200 and 400 people. They're transferred by relay teams of soldiers from one station to the next. The journey time to eastern Siberia takes on average 1 to 2 years. But the regime is concerned that people might be persuaded to try to while away their sentences in the deportation convoys, so your sentence doesn't begin to sort of tick until you reach your destination. So I came across one unfortunate in the archives who, as a result of illness and various other incidents, took a full 8 years to reach Irkutsk province, and only upon his arrival did the clock begin to tick down on his actual sentence. That process is modernised, so there is the introduction of steamships and then gradually railways, trains from the 1880s, 1890s onwards. But even at the very end of the 19th century, it remains a journey, significant stretches of which have to be navigated overland, either on carts or on foot. And I think actually for many, it's the most arduous, the most punishing aspect of the journey. So mortality rates are extremely high. These way stations in which prisoners overnight along the route are sort of disease-infested, squalid, collapsing barracks. Many contract typhus, dysentery, cholera, a whole range of illnesses that prove fatal.
There's a famous painting in Warsaw we can talk about this in a minute, of its Polish exiles being sent to Siberia. And there's a scene where they stop at there's a border post, which is supposed to be the border dividing Europe from Asia. So there's a moment where they walk into Asia. Actually, I'm not sure where it was.
It's on the boundary between Perm province and Taborsk province. So it's the mark of the administrative boundary between Europe and Russia.
So what happened? Was it just the Poles, or was that a significant stopping point for everybody?
No, it was so when George Kennan travels throughout Siberia in the late 1880s, he describes simple Russian peasants picking up soil from one side of the post and stuffing it into their pockets before they continue their journey. So I think as an administrative...
So people have the sense of going into somewhere different,
absolutely,
like a different country or a different civilization.
Yes, absolutely.
And just a note, that's George Kennan the Elder.
That's right, the Elder.
He was the uncle of the 20th century diplomat.
That's right.
George Kennan the Elder made a big trip around Russia and wrote that quite extensively. That's right.
And actually, in the painting you described by Sokochevsky, you can see prisoners sort of etching their names into this column as they pass it in a sort of, I suppose, an attempt to kind of stave off, the oblivion, that sort of way. So it can't. I mean, the Ural Mountains are not a significant physical boundary, but they were very clearly an extremely imposing, imaginative frontier that people crossed when they went into exile. I mean, obviously that's weakened by things like the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway at the end of the 19th century. But for those making the journey to Siberia in the 1820s, 1830s, they really felt like they were leaving behind civilization.
And but they didn't have the sense that they were going into oblivion and would never come back. They felt they would come back or not. What was the mentality?
So the states. Right from the earliest recorded instances of Siberian exile, the state sees punishment as something that can be combined with colonization. So the idea is that exiles will be banished to Siberia, some will be forced to serve out terms of penal labor, doing things like felling trees, constructing roads, working in mines and so on. Their families are encouraged, and in some cases coerced, into following them. And upon completion of their terms of penal labor or exile, they are only permitted to return to European Russia with the express consent of the authorities. So it is a, I mean that in some cases is forthcoming, but for hundreds of thousands of people it is a permanent banishment. So upon completion of their sentences, they are readmitted into the Siberian peasantry, but they're never allowed to make the journey home.
That actually makes me think that we should talk a little bit about, I mean, because the question of, is it supposed to be punishment, is it supposed to be colonization, or is it supposed to be some kind of rehabilitation, is exactly the same theme that you find in the early history of the Gulag in the 1920s and 30s, and there's a real kind of tug back and forth, and and I think and when you look at the history of the Gulag over however, certainly over Stalin's lifetime, there are different moments when one of those themes becomes more important than the other. So it starts out being, punishment, and then many of the first people who are in the early Gulag camps are in fact political prisoners, like Siberian prisoners. And then at a certain point, and the big turning point is in 1929 during the collectivization, when there were these mass arrests of peasants. At a certain point, the state suddenly shifts, and they begin looking at all these prisoners as potential as a workforce, and they suddenly see that this is the workforce that will help them, dig the coal in Vorkuta and dig the gold in Kolyma, and cut the forests in Novosibirsk, and they begin reorganizing the Gulag system into a sort of mass, forced labor system, and it's almost run. It's never actually economically successful, because how could it be with prisoners and run by guards? And actually, it's always incredibly inefficient. But they do think, and the interesting thing in the Gulag archives is that they think about it and talk about it as if it were economic. So all their language is economic. They begin talking about they measure the output production of the camps, and they measure the productivity of the prisoners, and they begin talking about it as if it's a huge economic system. But of course, it's all the time serving other functions as well. So it's got a prison function as well. And you must have the same conflict in the history of Siberia in the 19th century.
Yeah, certainly. So there are those. So the tension very often is within the Russian government itself between those who want to preserve Siberia's inaccessibility and its sort of status as this dreadful penal colony, and then there are others in the government who are arguing that actually Siberia is potentially Russia's California, this great economic colony which is just sort of awaiting the enterprising hand of Russians to kind of develop its potential and tap its resources. But there is also,
which is actually, by the way, true. I often, mentally made the comparison. I went to Vorkuta and I saw the coal mines up there, and I mentally made the comparison to Alaska, which is also, awful, basically. It's far north and it's above the Arctic Circle, and there are these very valuable minerals there. But, how did people think about? They thought about it entirely economically. Well, okay, we'll send teams in for 2 weeks. They'll dig coal for 2 weeks, and then they'll come back again, and we'll rotate people in and out, because you couldn't possibly live there. Whereas in the Soviet system, they thought, well, it doesn't cost. It although theoretically they were thinking economically, in practice they had all this free labor. So they said, okay, let's build a city up there. So they built Vorkuta, which was always economically a little bit peculiar. It had been colonized the way the American West was colonized. What if it had been done by incentive rather than by prisoners? But you were saying that in the 19th century people were already making that argument.
Yeah, so there's certain key figures within successive Tsarist governments are pushing for, in some cases, well, at least a restriction on the number of exiles, because they make the argument that these people are not supporting the state's wider colonial ambitions, they are impeding it and subverting it. So, we cast them out sort of under-resourced, destitute, they've very often been brutalized by the conditions of their captivity. They don't enter Siberia and then suddenly become converted into hardy frontier colonists, who are raising their families and establishing communities. They, hundreds of thousands of them. So the estimates are, by the end of the 19th century, anywhere up to a third of all Siberia's exiles and penal laborers are on the run. So there is this vast, deracinated, destitute population which just, roams around Siberia, begging, with some of them working as itinerant laborers, some of them pilfering tools and stealing livestock from Siberia's indigenous peoples and from the Russian peasantry who've settled there. So we're talking about a climate in which the loss of a horse can prove devastating to an entire family. So the kinds of punishments that are meted out to Siberia's horse thieves really are eye-watering. I won't go into them here, but yes, the state on the one hand is aware of these problems, so it continually runs up against its own administrative weakness, because the alternative to exile is the construction of a modern system of prisons within Russia, and it's also the creation of a police force that is able to maintain social control. So the big worry for Tsarist administrators is kind of crime, rural crime, urban crime. And I think in the middle of the 19th century, a territory the size of roughly England had a police force of 254 constables. So the state is simply unable to kind of maintain control over its own population, so it farms out these functions.
You have this again in the Soviet Union, the state is constantly making efforts to control everything, and down to greatest detail, and constantly fails to do so. And actually, of course, in the Soviet system, it actually, you can talk about this better than I can, but one of the ironies of the Tsarist system was that, as you were saying, people escaped actually from the camps or from their places of exile all the time. And famously, the Bolsheviks escaped. Stalin escaped something like 5 times. Lenin at least once. So they would get arrested, they would be sent to Siberia, and then they would somehow make it back to Zurich. And it was with this memory in his head, actually, that Stalin, and there's even a quote more or less along these lines at some point, that Stalin wanted to design the Gulag so that people won't escape. And so from the beginning, it's built differently. It doesn't, whereas the Tsarist exile system is kind of haphazard and it comes together over many years and it's sort of works and sort of doesn't. The Gulag from the beginning is designed so that you won't be able to escape from it. And the camps are put in very remote places where it would be impossible to get out and so on. But that was literally because of the Bolsheviks' own experiences in this rather sloppy Tsarist system. But this attempt, this desire to control, and that the state has to control it, the colonization or the settling of Siberia is something that the state should do and not something that entrepreneurs should do, or as in America, cowboys should do, is something you can see very, very early on.
Yeah, but I think one of the key differences is that by the time we reach the 1930s, this is for all of its overreach and its kind of administrative chaos, it is a much more powerful state.
Yeah,
so it has, it is an industrialized state. It has a developed network of railways. It is much more centralized, much more powerful. So you find in the late Tsarist period, right up to the end of the 19th century, for example, the state sanctions bounty hunters because it simply cannot catch all the exiles who flee. So you get 3 silver rubles for a fugitive exile, dead or alive. So there are some people. I think it's the Gilyaks in eastern Siberia have a kind of fearsome reputation as bounty hunters. Individuals notch up, dozens and dozens of kills. But this is a symptom again of a state that is unable to maintain control over its own prison population.
Although in the Gulag there are memoirists who talk about one of the reasons why they don't escape or why escape is so difficult is that particularly, for example, in Kazakhstan, a lot of the local populations and local people, and maybe I'd never thought of this before, maybe it's because they had this cultural memory of having been bounty hunters, are trained to look out for prisoners and know they'll make money if they capture one. So people who escape from the Gulag don't have any sense that they'll be welcomed or they'll be helped or anybody will help them escape further.
Really, I think in my opinion, the thing which prevents escape most effectively is the winter.
Yes.
So it just kind of looms over the system. So fugitives, the kind of colloquial, the contemporary colloquial term for the fugitives they are the foot soldiers of General Cuckoo's army, because they flee in the spring at the sound of a cuckoo, which kind of opens the doors to the possibility of absconding. It provides vegetation, berries, roots.
So this is absconding from the katorga, from the actual stockade?
From the places of exile.
Yeah, from places. So some of them are simply assigned to a village. So it's very easy to just up sticks and wander off into the taiga. Others are in penal settlements, but there are lots of escapes from penal settlements as well. But the point is that you have a window from roughly the end of May through to, when I was in Irkutsk researching, temperature at the beginning of September, the temperature dropped from about, 21 degrees to about -4 in 3 weeks. So winter descends incredibly quickly, and then basically surviving sort of kind of out there in the forests and on the steppe is almost impossible. So each spring, like some of the people I talk about in the book describe, these frozen corpses just appearing every spring of fugitives who've been caught in these blizzards, or indeed have been killed by villagers, and then the bodies are then gathered up each spring when the thaw arrives.
Yeah, no, you had that in the Gulag too. That there's in this spring people start talking about escaping, but I think it's just much rarer. There was the question that interested me that you brought up also in our previous conversation, which is the question of how this regime, how the camp regime reflected on the state's image abroad, because that also becomes really important to Stalinist Russia as well. They care a lot what people think and what people outside of Russia know about their camp system. How did it work in the 19th century?
So the exile system becomes sort of internationalized in the European and the American imagination, I think to a large extent by the Poles. So the Poles staged 2 great failed rebellions against St. Petersburg.
This is just because sort of a third of Poland is occupied by the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and then other bits of it are occupied by Prussia and Austro-Hungary. But the worst insurrections are in the Russian part.
Yeah. So in 1830 and again in 1863, the Polish nobility launches a kind of bid for independence. And in both cases, they are eventually defeated by the Tsars' armies. And at those 2 junctures, there are waves of, I think in both cases, it's about 20,000 Poles are exiled to Siberia, many to very, very long terms of penal labor. And the Poles are regarded in Western Europe, and particularly in France, but also in the United States, as kind of fellow republicans. These are Europeans. This is not the Tsar doing this to sort of legitimate Tsarist subjects. But this is an example of Russia kind of reaching out and crushing a European nation with long traditions of kind of self-rule, and of course Italians and French and Swiss and so on are also caught up, and many of them go to fight alongside the Poles and find themselves exiled to Siberia. And the point is that these Poles are drawn from highly educated families, many of them conversant in several European languages, and they have a fantastic PR machine. And their families and musicians and authors, painters across Europe are publicising their fate. And so really by the 80s, and it's debated in the House of Commons here, it's the French press is full of stories of the plight of these martyred sons of Poland in Siberia. And I think that really kind of thrusts Siberia into the forefront of Western consciousness. But then as a later generation, so in the 1880s and 1890s, as Russian revolutionaries are then exiled to Siberia and stage protests against their captors, this is now happening in an age of effectively mass media. What's happening in Eastern Siberia is being reported in the pages of the New York Times and the London Times. There are demonstrations on Hyde Park Corner. The Railway Children. Who remembers the Railway Children? The Railway Children has in it.
It's a famous, if you don't know it, English children's book, and there's a wonderful, you explained, there's a wonderful scene where, and I won't tell you the whole plot, but where these group of children who spend all their time by the railway station for various reasons meet a Russian, right?
Yeah,
and who is the Russian?
Yeah, he's a Russian dissident who's spent many years in Siberian exile.
And sometimes they've met him at the train station. He's lost or something.
Yeah. So it's such a prevalent kind of motif that it even sort of finds its way into Victorian children's literature. So that's published in 1905. But this is a real problem for the regime because one of the Frenchmen who ends up exiled to Siberia and is eventually released, I think, after about 15 years, and goes back to Paris and writes his this memoir, and he says in it that if you have a prison system like the exile system, you should never let anyone go, because when they are released, they will tell their story, and their stories will serve as kind of a recruiting sergeant for subsequent waves of dissidents and revolutionaries.
Right. And of course, in the 20th century, the sort of the cover-up of the Gulag becomes a really important part of what it is. So initially, there are camps in the original Soviet, the first concentration camp, the first sort of formal concentration camps are in the Sovietsky Islands and in Western Russia, where they're doing mostly logging. And there begin to be already in the 1920s, there are these, you get debates in the House of Commons, you get articles in the Times, people objecting to this cheap wood that's coming from Russia because it's cut down with slave labor. And there begin to be boycotts or calls for boycotts actually of Russian wood. And so the awareness of the system is there even then. And this is partly was in order to hide it that Stalin changes the nature of the system in the late 1929, early 1930s, and he moves a lot of it towards the east, and it becomes much more secretive, and so much so that camps are often not named by names, they're given numbers, prisoners aren't, very little information is given to families of where prisoners are. It's kept absolutely in the shadows from the 1930s, and there are a number of reasons for that. But one of them is to hide its existence from the West. And of course, it's a different story. In the case of the Soviet Union, the reason for that was, their foreign policy was, world revolution. We are the model state, we are the model for the world proletariat, and we want people to follow us. And so the camps were considered to be undermining of that very important international image as the international leaders of the international proletariat. And so they felt this need to hide it. But presumably Tsarist Russia didn't need to hide.
It does begin to. So by the 1870s, 1880s, this is an autocracy that is in a way functioning now, or is being forced to function in an age of mass politics. There is a public sphere. There is an explosion in publishing. Educated Russia is making its kind of presence felt partly through these sort of NGOs or civil society organisations. There is a public opinion to be contended with. And actually, I think one of the earlier questions was, at what point does sort of knowledge of this begin to leak out? So I suppose Dostoevsky's publication of The Notes of the House of the Dead in 1863 is a kind of seminal text, because it kind of takes the Russian reading public inside what was a penal fort in Western Siberia, where Dostoevsky spent 4 years. So it's kind of a fictionalized autobiography. I mean, Dostoevsky is
which I seem to remember he's very mean to the Polish character.
He's extremely mean to the Polish characters, yes. But he, he uses a fictionalized narrator, Galianchikov, who is basically Dostoevsky, but it's clearly a device to sort of ease it past the Tsarist censor. But really, by the 1880s, there are, within the Russian, sort of serious press, there are flood of articles about the exile system, and it's one of the few things which actually unites an otherwise very polarized Russian sort of civil society. Radicals denounce the iniquities in kind of wealth and power which drive the banishment of so many Russians. Liberals criticize it for its lack of a kind of legal foundation, and even conservatives are deeply disturbed by, particularly actually by the plight of women and children, which kind of brings me on to
I was just going to connect to Chekhov. So one of the most famous investigations of the Gulag that happens, not the Gulag, sorry, of the Siberian exile system is carried out by one of Russia's greatest writers, who's Chekhov. So how did that impact people? How was that received?
I think I suppose there are two key issues in Chekhov's travelogue, which do really, already the system is kind of tottering. There are endless conversations about the need to reform it, about the need to reduce the numbers of exiles, to improve conditions. But really, it never recovers from the kind of moral body blow that Chekhov's writing delivers. And I think it's on two fronts. One is the question of corporal punishment, which has been significantly reduced, though not abolished, in Russia in 1863, but it's still used as a matter of course within the exile system. And Chekhov has extremely kind of graphic descriptions of not only of the effects of birching or using the lash on the prisoners, but also the way in which it's simply a kind of casual instrument which is designed to kind of shore up the personal authority, or indeed satisfy the sadistic impulses of individual prison guards. But the other key issue is the treatment of women and children. So on Sakhalin, there are about 6,000 women and children. Most of the women have gone there as what are called volunteers, who followed their husbands to Sakhalin. Although many of them face a life of complete kind of destitution and abandonment if they stay back in Russia, so the degree to which they volunteer is very much open to question. But almost all of them are forced into prostitution. And Chekhov details, 12-year-old girls who are infected with syphilis, the corruption of families, women who are innocent of any crime, who arrive on Sakhalin and are confronted with such conditions of absolute penury that they are then forced to go and sell their own bodies. So he presents Russian society with this picture of complete moral collapse. And of course, that's a very difficult issue for a regime which sort of rests upon the idea of paternalism. The Tsar was a father to his people. this is the kind of contract that underpins the Russian autocracy, is that the Tsar provides security and care in exchange for obedience. This sort of expose of the conditions in which Russian, the wives and the children of penal labourers are forced to exist is really explosive. And as a direct result of Cherkov's publication, there are then various commissions set up which in 1900 issue a new ruling designed to limit the use of exile, but that eventually gets overtaken by the 1905 revolution.
I wonder if the correct analogy, 20th century analogy of that isn't Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn's book, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was really the first sort of, authentic description of what life was like in the camps, also had this explosive impact in the Soviet Union, and also part of the reason why was because it conflicted with the Soviet Union's image of itself.
It's 1962, right?
That's 1962. Yeah. He then wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which was a much bigger project, which is about 10 years later. But the first, this is just a short story, Denisovich, but it has this impact, because it's a similar thing, it undermines the claims of the regime. The regime this is the workers' state.
It also appeared in print, so it was available.
It appeared in print.
The Gulag was a samizdat.
The Gulag was samizdat, but this was a.
Ivan Denisovich is actually published in Norway.
Yeah, exactly.
So
in print.
So it is actually widely.
So it's widely available, and it's funny because it's published. It'd be interesting if there's an analogy here too. It's published in part as a part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization attempt. So it's actually a political gesture. I'm publishing this as a sort of, Khrushchev is publishing this as a gesture towards this, the Stalinists who are still in the regime to show, and it's a part of a political argument. And then really quite quickly, sort of 2 or 3 years later, you can't imagine it being published because it then shuts up again.
That's very similar with this book, Dostoevsky's Notes from the House of the Dead. He's very careful in the introduction to describe the olden times in Siberian exile. So basically referring to the reign of Nicholas I, and he of course is publishing at the beginning of the reign of Alexander II. So there's this kind of there's this sort of nod and a wink to the reader that we both know that actually I'm talking about a reality which persists to this day, but I'm going to pretend that it's a long time ago, and so are you.
It's interesting because Dostoevsky writes in 1863, you say it's really at the very beginning of the great reforms that Alexander introduces, and it's not simply the emancipation of serfs, but a whole series of other reforms from universities to the military to the judiciary, but not the penal system. That really takes Chekhov some 30 or 40 years later to start that process of reform, but it's cut short with 1905 and the huge repressions of 1906, and the need to do something with all of these people who were being captured. And so again, you have a state which is short on resources, yet needs to establish strong control. And I think before we open it up to the group, I want to follow up with a question. To what extent did the threat of Siberian exile loom large in the mind of Russians in the early mid-19th century? You describe, for example, this moment in a novel by Turgenev, in which there's a landlady who is modeled after, I guess, his grandmother or his mother's grandmother, and she doesn't like what one of the servants has done, failed to show adequate respect. She banishes the servant to Siberia, and as a landlord has the authority to do this. To what extent did this effectively act as a tool of relatively low-cost social control?
Yeah, it certainly does act very, very powerfully, precisely in that way. I suppose one of the things that surprised me was, so it's clearly used to shore up the most abusive features of feudalism in Russia. It's used very casually within the institution of serfdom, within the military, and so on. But what I was more surprised by was the way in which it's embraced by peasant communities, by merchant communities themselves as a tool of social control. So one of the cases I came across was of a village that burned down. It may have been an arson attack, it wasn't clear, but sort of 50 odd homes were destroyed in a fire in this village. When the village started to be rebuilt, a group of sort of 15 families were accused. There's this catch-all phrase, durное поведение, sort of obscene behavior. And this was a term for which this was a charge for which the punishment could be exiled to Siberia. So 15 of these peasant families were suddenly accused of obscene behavior within the village. And on this particular occasion, there was actually a proper investigation. And of course, it turned out that the 15 village households that were accused of this obscene behavior were those who had no funds for the reconstruction of their homes and were therefore kind of surplus, sort of kind of economic freight on the rest of the village. And one of the things that Tsarist administrators are continually across the 19th century complaining about is that they are being sent the old, frail, the sick, the blind.
Which is exactly what the Gulag
So people who are no longer economically productive.
Yeah.
So I mean, it certainly is the case that the exile system shores up these, kind of vertical power relations within Russian society, but it also tells us something, I suppose rather more uncomfortable about the way in which, peasants and merchants were pretty hard-eyed about dispensing with people who were now surplus to the needs of their communities. So it's precisely its flexibility and its lack of clear juridical foundation which means that it was open to tremendous abuse.
This does remind one to a certain extent of the complex forces that were behind the purges as well. There's no single explanation as to why they happened. Sometimes it was just score settling among people and had no basis in law, or it really wasn't rooted in enemies of the people. But we have friends of Pushkin House here who we'd like to open up the floor to. So please, the floor is yours. Who would like to ask the first question?
Thank you for that discussion. I'd be interested to hear your views both on why it is that almost uniquely among sort of modern educated European states, Russia has, throughout its history and now, proven so impervious to the sort of democratizing and liberalizing movements that we've seen elsewhere. It's all gone from paternalism to Bolshevism and back to paternalism. It seems a bit integrated.
It's a very broad question, and I'm wondering whether there is a tie-in at all to the immediate topic. And I think some people would question your characterization of it never having given...
Yes, I would answer that by saying there have been some moments when it was not, and there have been some very important kind of liberal thinkers in Russia. Even very creative ones. One of the best examples is probably the Russian human rights movement, which emerges in the 60s, just after the Solzhenitsyn publication. The Russians essentially, the sort of Russian dissidents of that era of the 60s and 70s, essentially invented the modern idea of human rights as an organized movement. They invented the idea of internationalizing the problem, of calling on Russia to meet its international obligations and the treaties that it signed. They were incredibly sophisticated about contacting outsiders and using outside pressure. And so you go through the history of Russia and you do have these creative and interesting liberal moments and liberal people. And of course, I think you have it also in the 1990s, which people are very negative about now, but there is also this burst of creativity, really interesting journalism that suddenly comes from nowhere. Suddenly everybody turns out to be very good at writing and reporting. And you have what you really have in Russia is a kind of alternation. And the key to it, in my view, the key problem is the one that I hinted at a little bit earlier, which is that there is a tradition, and it's a Tsarist tradition, but then it was a really very, very, very important to not just the communist mindset, but to the KGB mindset, which is this tradition of the need to control. Allowing things to happen spontaneously, allowing civic movements to develop as they wish, allowing artistic movements to go in whatever direction they want, that is dangerous to the state. And there's a definition of the state that anybody who's, there is no formula for a kind of patriotic objector. So, if you object to the state or you're critical of the state, then you're an enemy of the state. Or you're somehow a foreign stooge. So you get this, repetitively all the way through. So as I said, that comes into conflict with this tradition of Russian liberalism, which is also there.
But I think perhaps the most important moment in Russian liberalism is even earlier, and it comes back to Chekhov's time. From 1890s up to 1917, Chekhov was writing for the emerging middle class. He himself was a middle class doctor. And there was a whole group of professionals who were emerging at this point as a result of the industrialization and urbanization that was taking place. They were not dependent on the state for protection of their land holdings because that's not where their wealth came from. And they became very well organized starting after 1905 in particular. Very sophisticated, read the works of Peter Struve, for example, one of the most articulate writers on liberal democracy anywhere in Europe.
Or read Nabokov's memoir.
Yes.
Speak
anyway, so not to get distracted from the topic because there are others, but there are these moments. The question is why those moments were never able
it may be,
to achieve orbit.
It may be a lot to do with what happened in 1917. What if the Bolsheviks hadn't won?
Yes.
Then we might have had
That's it. It's a good topic for this year, but a different topic for this year.
You worked on these same subjects too. So what do you think?
I suppose I would simply say that it's. It all depends from the perspective that one. Or rather, it depends on the context. If what the Tsarist Empire was extremely repressive. The French Third Republic could be extremely repressive as well. The Prussian state could be extremely repressive. Even the prison population within the United States, in the 19th and early 20th century. So I'm not, and I think in terms of the. Obviously the Stalinist state is spectacularly brutal in very distinctive ways. But I think if you view it alongside Franco's Spain, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, even sort of slightly less egregious cases like Horthy's Hungary and so on, it starts to look more like one very extreme manifestation of stuff that's going on kind of everywhere. So I would be kind of reluctant to sort of single out Russia too much. I think somehow positively very different.
The difference happens after the war, isn't it? When it becomes very,
Which war?
Second World War. After the Second World War, you have this democratization of Europe, and Russia doesn't join that. That's probably the other key moment.
Or it takes 50 years.
Or it takes 50 years.
Please. Yes.
Well, I just wondered as well, is the geography and the weather and so on so extreme in Russia, but also in this dreadful island, which I'm not quite sure the name of.
Sakhalin.
Yeah. Were there equivalents of Inuits there as well? What happened there?
Yes.
Yes. So there are the number of it's difficult to distinguish sort of indigenous peoples from. There's a group that emerges from roughly the end of the 16th century through to the 19th of what are called Old Siberians, who are a kind of mixed bunch of, some of them are indigenous people, some of them are former Russian soldiers who settled, some of them former exiles, so they kind of get very mixed up over the course of this period. But yeah, there are hundreds of thousands of native peoples across Siberia
Lots of them.
who engage in, many of them are still nomadic or partially nomadic. They're kind of hunters and trappers and fur traders and so on. And they sort of rub along in very uncomfortable ways with, certainly with the exile population, but also to some extent with the Russian settlers who are in the second half of the 19th century, who are moving to Siberia in very, very great numbers, kind of fleeing land hunger back in European Russia. Many of them, so by the 1890s, the state is actually supporting this. It subsidizes the rail fares for Russian peasants to move to Siberia because this is part of a new policy of kind of, our East, as it's called, sort of colonization of Siberia. So they kind of exist around the exile system. They're very resentful of the exiles, fugitive exiles. But yes, they are an important part of the picture as well.
You said that the famous writers, Tsars, etc., helped to disseminate publicity. But what about earlier in the century? Because the Decembrists in Paris in 1825. This was a huge scandal.
Daniel's book opens with the Decembrists.
Sorry?
It opens with a very brilliant description of the
So I'm
Decembrists.
just thinking in terms of publicity. I mean, this must have been a seismic event, wasn't it?
The question is about the role of the Decembrists in the first quarter of the 19th century of raising public awareness about
So you
Siberia.
date the whole thing from that point.
Yeah, the book starts probably at the beginning of the 19th century. But of course, yes, the Decembrists are enormously important. It remains, however, a story within the Russian elite, effectively. So nothing is published about the Decembrists in the reign of Nicholas I. But they are extreme. They're almost like sort of depth charges through time because their stories are suddenly published then in the reign of Alexander II. At which point they serve as kind of models for a later generation of revolutionaries. But yes, it's almost a form of kind of civil war within the Russian elite, the Decembrist uprising. So the Decembrists are themselves drawn from the very elite families. Sergei Volkonsky is a playmate of Nicholas when he's a boy, and Nicholas clearly takes his involvement in the rebellion as a sort of personal betrayal.
But they don't go manacled on the Vladimir Road.
No, they don't, but they may as well have done. Well, actually, no, they do go manacled. They do go manacled, but they are driven there in carts. And some of them, one of them, von Wiesen, uses some of his several thousand rubles to pay his guards to kind of wait on them and to ensure they're supplied with nice food. So, the Decembrists are kind of are a very odd group because they are supplied and resourced in ways that are almost unimaginable, or actually for almost any other group.
Yeah, but at the time, Europe was very shocked, and I think Russia was also very shocked that you could send aristocrats, to prison like that en masse.
Yeah, although of course if they had participated in a similar rebellion in most states, they would have been executed. So the Decembrists acquire this tremendous power as kind of martyrs. And what I argue in the book is that part of their stories really matter. Certainly in the reign of Nicholas I. And the great story that the Decembrists tell, their wives follow them to Siberia. They're choosing kind of love over loyalty to the Tsars. So there's this kind of repudiation of the culture of the court. But they also act out in exile their republican ideals. They commit themselves to the service of the Siberian people. They set up a prisoners' commune where they have elections and chairmen and kind of rotating almost kind of little prime ministers. So they're kind of playing at republican politics. In way, one of them says it's our own Lilliputian republic. But that idea, that kind of model of an alternative form of political organisation, is one which becomes hugely important as the century progresses.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found it fascinating because that idea of exile, you still see today in the Russian prison system. I mean, it is astonishing to me that people are still being transported 5,000 kilometres from their home to prison. And I just find it amazing that that investment in the infrastructure of a normal prison system has never happened, and to this day it's not happening. And I just wonder, why is this? Is it simply that this is the way things always were? People always did it this way, and there's just no thinking that it's possible to do it another way. Is it also economic, maybe? Is it the economic use of these prison camps that are still economic units?
Well, yeah, I think quite a lot of it is it's the continuity of inertia. So you had prison systems which were they were taken over by the Soviets. They then Taborsk, which is it's astonishing. The central penal labor prison in Taborsk is on the central town square. So this was the place through prisoners were marched through the town into the prison, and this was the kind of gateway to this wider sort of penal realm. That was taken over by the Soviet regime and was used as a prison, I think, right up until 1989. When it was closed and a facility was opened nearby. So to some extent, I think it is just that there is this kind of footprint, but I think it is also about within the Russian sort of penal imagination, if you like, distance is a very a movement is a very powerful exercise of state authority. So when Khodorkovsky, ends up in Chita, which is where the Decembrists were, for example, it's not. I mean, I'm not saying it but deliberately, because it would seem a curious thing to do it consciously. But clearly, this idea of moving people away from the centre, stripping them of daily, kind of contact with friends and family. And also making the deportation system. One of my colleagues in Oxford works on women in Russian prisons. Yes, exactly, yeah. And she talks about the way in which the train journeys last weeks because you are being moved around. Yeah, months. Yes, you are being left inside cars and so on. So again, it's I think I don't have a kind of clear. There are very suggestive sort of continuities. I don't have a clear.
I think the point about the buildings being the same, I was in a prison in Arkhangelsk in the 1990s, which was the same as it had been the Stalinist prison, and before that it had been the Tsarist prison, and it looked to me like the descriptions of Stalinist prisons. I mean, the way that people were gathered around in the cells and so on. I mean, I think a lot of it is just, that's always been the building, and we're confusing it. So.
But like in Chekhov's time, there are NGOs which are emerging to address issues around the prison system, both about drug-resistant disease, in particular TB, which is a big issue and affects everybody. Then there's the use of the prison system to settle political or actually business conflicts. And then finally, there's the use of prison labor as effectively forced labor for private enterprise. And so these are all issues that are being looked at today. There are NGOs emerging, but obviously they're very, very difficult.
It's amazingly similar.
And a lot of great people involved. In the back, please, on the left.
You mentioned that some people escaped or were recaptured. Have you any comment on people re-offending and being released back into civilization and then being naughty again and having to be sent back?
Yes, there are lots of, I don't want to give the impression that every single person who was exiled to Siberia was a terrible, victim of a miscarriage of justice. I mean, clearly many of them are deeply unpleasant individuals that any system would have had to kind of do something about. This is, again, to come back to Dostoevsky, one of the points that he makes, when he's first released, he writes letters to his brother saying, you cannot imagine how awful it is. These men are monsters, they don't have a shred of remorse, there's not one scintilla of conscience among any of them. And then sort of 20 years later, when he's kind of fully into his native soil conservatism, he kind of reimagines this, and he talks about how they were all, every single one of them was praying every day, and not, there was not a man among them who was not tortured by the knowledge of his wrongdoing. So yeah, some of them are extremely dangerous individuals, and they visit a crime wave across Siberia, which is very widely reported in the 1880s and 1890s. And really quite awful murders and rapes and mutilations and so on of Siberian townspeople, villagers, merchants on the roads are extremely vulnerable to attack. And usually, at least from the press reports and from the Interior Ministry reports, when offenders are caught, they tend to be those who are either fugitive exiles or they're exiles who have served out their sentences, and are now kind of working as janitors somewhere, but they have a little sideline in kidnapping and extortion. It's a major problem, and it's one of the things which actually foments a kind of almost a secessionist movement within Siberia, because as Siberia's towns grow and it starts to have its own regional newspapers and so on, they are fiercely critical of a government policy which basically dumps European Russia's criminals on the Siberians. Towns like Taborsk had gangs, riding through the town, like something out in the Wild West, in the Wild East, riding through the town and lassoing, well-to-do looking denizens of the town, and then dragging them off and ransoming, holding them hostage. So it is a major problem. In theory, the system is supposed to bring about rehabilitation, but it does nothing of the sort. And that's one of the things for which it's criticised.
Okay. I want to take two in the interest of fitting things in here and here, please, and then we'll have a couple more at the back, please.
Since you already studied this topic, I was just wondering if your book covers this kind of handover process. As you mentioned that some of them really were really bad people. I mean, this handover of the Tsarist model into Soviet. I mean, do they still keep them? Because as we know, that Soviet system were saying that there was no crime in the Soviet Union. There was really friendly people, and how was this process? Were they still trying to keep all those bad people in the prisons?
Let's take a second one as well, please.
I'm just interested, how did you find finding the information in Russian archives? Because the Russian authorities do not want to disclose anything.
Well, I'll take the first point, the first question.
About archives.
So about archives, so what was it like working in archives? So I did about 15 months of archival research in Petersburg, Moscow, and then in various towns across Siberia. And I have to say, actually, on the whole, I think working in the pre-revolutionary period, I didn't have any sense in which people were kind of, not showing me documents. I mean, the archives are terribly underfunded. I mean, certainly the regional archives. So reading rooms are open sort of 2 days a week. You can only order 5 files at a time. The cataloguing isn't very good. So you have files that just say correspondence about exiles, and it can be something really fascinating, or it can be just pages and pages of shipments of shoes to soldiers in some far-flung penal settlement. I didn't detect any kind of resistance, and actually on the contrary, I found that in the smaller archives they were extremely pleased to sort of share the material that they had. And I think you had this kind of weird status as someone who'd come all the way from London, for reasons that they couldn't fathom. No, not at all. So I mean, my colleagues who work on the later periods. I think there really was, if you work on the Stalin period and the war in particular, actually, There was this kind of window in the early 90s to kind of late
No,
late
up
90s.
until the early
So
2000s.
this, when you had much more chance of getting access, and then it's been.
No, there
sort
was
of
very
taken
open
away.
access in the 90s up until about the middle of the 2000s.
And on the second question, so I don't really have a clear explanation for the passage from one to the other. So the exile system effectively implodes in 1917. There are mass escapes, there is an amnesty, and what's left of the system just gets torn up in the Civil War. You know, these sort of fronts that roam backwards and forwards across Siberia. Of course, many of the prison guards suddenly find themselves extremely vulnerable to reprisals from prisoners that they are holding. But the Soviet state is kind of dealing with a very similar set of problems in a way. It's dealing with the question of how do you manage crime in what is still basically an undergoverned society. How do you cope with the social disorder that's generated by rapid change, rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, that sort of thing? And how do you cope with the rise of opposition and dissenting movements? So some of the people about whom I write had the unfortunate privilege of being able to compare the two systems. So they are exiled under the Tsars, socialist revolutions and so on, and then find themselves rearrested, usually at the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s. Yeah, and they are. So
And then they start complaining that the circumstances are worse now.
Yeah,
It's better in the zone.
And they kind of look back as well fondly on their time before 1970.
I think we've got three more that we'll take all at once. But make them brief, please. And these are the last 1, 2, and I think 3 back in the corner.
Yes, hi. You had mentioned kind of tangentially as a response to a question at the beginning, the French Republic, and I was just curious, and Anne, I believe you've written about this, but what you might think about sort of the pro-Russian, foreign policy and big economics of French policy right now, and how it goes into the modern relationship with Russia.
Sorry, French foreign policy towards Russia now?
Yes.
Today, let's take the other two questions, please. Yeah, please. It's an interesting topic, but it's a bit off the ceiling.
I'll talk to you about it afterwards.
This vast prisoner exile population, who are the jailers? It takes an enormous workforce to keep these people going. What do they do? Are they social workers, corrective workers?
No, most
And the third question.
I just wondered whether you might talk a little bit about whether there was any reactive incidents to Bolshevik policy and say pre-revolutionary Russia political to some of them ran in quite progressive circles in terms of European community, and whether, as Anne was talking about, in terms of foreign perceptions of the system through the 30s, perhaps through the 20s as well, there was deliberate engagement with anything pre-revolution, despite the Bolshevik ideology.
okay.
Jailers.
So the jailers are overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of the Russian army. So most of them are former soldiers who've been conscripted into it's either the Ministry of the Interior or the Ministry of War, depending on where it is in Siberia. The average profile is, sort of bachelors in their 40s, 50s, who, kind of. I don't think it's first choice posting for most of them. But they are part of the kind of settled Siberian population. The administrators, kind of at the level of like prison warders, those in charge of the deportation process. So they're kind of middle-ranking civil servants who will be expected to be posted around the empire. But some of them are kind of making their way through the imperial bureaucracy. and some of them that's just the day job, that's where they live. This is a
So in the Soviet system, they are the NKVD and then they're the KGB. I mean, they're part of the political police, and it's considered all the way through a really bad job. I mean, it's not a post that you want. I mean, for certainly the ordinary jailers, and a lot of them are there because they've done something wrong. It's a sort of form of punishment inside the NKVD would be to be sent to be a guard in Siberia. And I guess the one exception is there are these moments when, there are these really huge camps in the 40s, these kind of enormous camp systems, which are sort of almost quite wealthy, and to be the head of one of those was really quite grand. You have a big house, and you would have servants from the prisoners, and you would probably have an orchestra composed of prisoner musicians and so on. And they would be, some of them were competitive with one another. They would have football teams that would play each other, were made up of prisoners. So there was that was prestigious, but almost all the other jobs in the system were considered bad, and you didn't want them. And I didn't hear the final.
Yeah,
we didn't really hear. We couldn't hear it very well.
Could you just repeat your question, please?
Briefly.
I was wondering about whether there was any, I'm thinking of work that Peter H. Solomon has done, it's covered up with a very progressive strand of Bolshevik penal policy early on in the 20s. How much the Bolsheviks might have drawn on pre-revolutionary liberal theorists.
Oh, that's what we were thinking before.
Yeah, well actually,
absolutely, yes. The answer is yes.
Yeah, so my first book, which is a tougher read,
Renovating Russia.
With the catchy title "Renovating Russia: The Human Sciences and Fate of Modernity," makes exactly that argument. Actually, that if you look at kind of criminal theorists in the 1920s who are talking about what a prison system should look like, what the functions of state penal policy, what the ambition should be, they're drawing very, very heavily on the work of late imperial liberal theorists and progressives, who believe that basically crime is a function of the environment. That if you can structure an environment properly, you will be able to cure prisoners. So in the late imperial period, they talk about curative labor colonies, and within the kind of within the Soviet state, the 1920s, right into the early 1930s. The prison system is talked about in almost identical ways.
Not inside the prison system, but there are sort of propagandists of the prison system who talk about that. Most famously, Gorky, who talks about reform of juvenile delinquents a lot and writes about the White Sea Canal camps in that context. Although it's something that, and they would sometimes use that kind of language inside the Gulag camps, but the prisoners would make fun of it. I mean, it wasn't. So the idea of rehabilitation was theoretically there. And there was actually some kind of apparatus attached to it, but it didn't really work in practice.
Well, before we grant you amnesty and release you, you've been a wonderful captive audience, thank you. But I'd like to ask you to thank Daniel and Anne for a fantastic